meanwhile, just relax and then we'll take off. Thank you very much. Morning once again, everyone. We are welcome to this great event. Like why are we here today? We are here for a workshop on the mainstreaming climate finance actions in
Hello, Moses. I think we can't hear you.
Yes.
Yeah, we cannot. Good. You reassured me, Alhamdulillah. I was concerned it was my connection.
I think it's on his side. Good morning, Stefan.
Good morning, Alhamdulillah.
We will try to restart his connection. Just give us a few seconds. Thank you.
Yeah, good morning, Stefan. Good morning. I think while waiting for Moses, I think we can go straight to the agenda since the two of you are there, and also want to find out from Siri, Siri.
Yes,
are you set from your side?
Yes, we are set. My vice chair is there. Is there. So we are set.
Okay. Thank you, Siri. I think we should just give Moses is the moderator. I think he's having connection problems. I think we have all the officials available. I think we should just give him 1 or 2 minutes for him to reconnect again.
Okay, that's fine, Gerald. Just let us know.
I'm sorry for what happened briefly. I had a little bit of glitch with my...
Mr. Moses, can you keep your video off if it is affecting your connection? Keep your video off.
So I'm sorry once again for what happened briefly, and then we'll take off almost immediately. First and foremost, we are here for the workshop on mainstreaming climate finance actions in national DFIs, that's development finance institutions in Africa. So this event is being put together by the African Development Bank's Climate Change and Green Growth Department in association with the African Development Finance Institutions in collaboration with the Natural Eco Capitals organizers and coordinators. So as we move on, it's important that we understand the objectives of this workshop. The first one, just for clarity, to be sure that those of us who are in the same room understand why we are here, is to be more with additional knowledge and capacity to support the various African countries' climate resilient economies. Secondly, is to be in position to scale climate action based on enhanced awareness on climate finance actions, opportunities, and challenges. Also, is to help us to understand the importance and application of climate change mainstreaming and use of climate change tools. To also help us to understand the expected rules of national DFIs in climate risk management. It will also help us to understand the concept of incremental cost and climate finance. In addition, it will improve awareness and knowledge of private sector actors, such as project developers, sponsors, investors, banks, insurance, and leasing companies about investment in implementation. So why we go through this today, I want to welcome all of us for being part of this time so that we can have our opening address. I would like to invite a welcome address from Amdo Dosuma, officer in charge of roads and development.
Thank you very much, Moses. I think we are having some connection issues, so I'm also going to put off my video, but just to show my face to ensure that you can hear me. First of all, let me thank you, Moses, for setting the scene for that workshop. And good morning, everybody from Abidjan, and also outside of Côte d'Ivoire. I know many people have connected from several places in Africa and around the world. Let me first welcome and thank you for joining us for this very especially important workshop, which is focused on mainstreaming climate actions in development finance institutions. My name is Alhamdou Dosuma. I'm the acting director of the bank's Climate Change and Green Growth Department. I'm excited to be here today with you to open this workshop alongside Stefan Naletambi, the AfDB's Director for Financial Sector Development, and Mr. Thabo Tamane, the Chairman of the Association of African Development Finance Institutions. I have 2 points to make. First, why this initiative? And the second point, what is AfDB's response and role to address the challenges we are facing on climate change? Let me provide some general context and rationale behind this initiative. As you all know, the 2015 Paris Agreement committed almost 200 countries, including 54 African countries, to place limits on global temperature rise and to fight the impacts of climate change. The agreement resulted in each country developing its own plans to fight climate change and build resilience to its impacts. These plans are outlined in each country's nationally determined contributions, known as NDCs. The implementation of these NDCs is expected to provide a significant opportunity for private sector participation in climate actions and to enhance green investments in Africa. According to our analysis at the African Development Bank, the NDCs developed by African countries represent an estimated $3 trillion investment by 2030. At least 75% of this investment is expected to come from the private sector across several key industries. However, private sector participation in green and resilient investments in Africa remains very weak and needs to be strengthened in order to take advantage of the abundant opportunities for green investment on the African continent. My second point, as I said, is what is AfDB doing to address the challenge? As a response to climate change, the bank has recently launched several key initiatives, including the $20 billion Desert to Power program to build the largest solar zone in the Sahel in order to provide electricity for 250 million people and help to protect the Great Green Wall initiative that was proposed by African leaders to regreen the Sahel. The bank is also working in partnership with the Global Center on Adaptation, GCA, to deliver the ambitious African Adaptation Acceleration Program, known as AAAP, to mobilize $25 billion for adaptation by 2025. We are also developing innovative instruments such as the green banks and national climate change funds, the adaptation benefits mechanism, and the continent's first resilient bond. To enhance private sector participation in climate actions, the bank has launched last year the Private Sector Investment Initiative for Nationally Determined Contributions in Africa. These initiatives has identified several entry points for the private sector to participate in NDC implementation in 7 key priority sectors, including agribusiness and forestry, renewable energy and energy efficiency, waste management, water and irrigation, green buildings and cities, transport and infrastructure, and the financial sector. The bank also recognizes that private sector's ability to contribute to Africa's climate resilience and green recovery agenda is constrained by the limited capacity, technical capacity, lack of bankable projects, ability to raise climate funds, and availability of reliable climate information. To address these challenges, the bank engaged in policy dialogues with Africa's private sector, with the aim to creating an enabling environment for private sector participation in climate actions in Africa. For instance, the bank has delivered several training programs and several capacity building activities to raise the awareness of private sector and financial industry, including SMEs, commercial banks, etc. Targeted capacity building activities have also been carried out in various countries, including Nigeria, Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, Liberia, and Kenya, and help African SMEs and commercial banks identify climate risk and opportunities in their businesses and estimate the impact of their business activities on greenhouse gas emissions. At the bank, we are currently supporting African countries through lending and non-lending operations to meet the targets set out in their NDCs. Through our lending operations, we have already committed through 2.3 billion on our own funds towards climate action in 2017. We increased that commitment to 3.3 billion in 2018 and to 3.6 billion in 2019. The bank also mobilizes several climate finance resources from several funds, such as the Green Climate Fund, the Climate Investment Fund, and the Global Environment Facility. Over the next 5 years, until 2025, we have pledged to commit 25 billion towards climate action on the continent. In addition to this, we provide technical assistance support to African countries through various platforms for technical assistance to African governments, financial institutions, and the private sector. And these platforms include, for instance, the Africa NDC Hub, the regional office of the Global Center on Adaptation, which we host since last year, and the African Financial Alliance on Climate Change, AFAC. More specifically, the AFAC seeks to unlock private finance and incentivize Africa's financial system towards green investments. Today's workshop builds on the work of the AFAC, the African Financial Alliance on Climate Change, and we will hear more about this AFAC initiative from my colleague Davina and how you can participate in the alliance during the workshop. Moving forward, the bank is currently developing a new strategic framework on climate change and green growth in order to consolidate all the achievements made so far and provide us with a new vision and agenda for our future interventions on climate change and green growth. Let me conclude by encouraging all of us to participate actively in these discussions. We have to raise questions, and please let us know your perspectives on those issues. I look forward to a robust discussion with our esteemed panelists and distinguished participants. I expect that this event will inform and strengthen DFI participation in climate action. Thank you very much. Back to you, Moses.
Yeah, thank you very much, Madu, for that great opening welcome address. That is great, and I'm sure it has set a tone for today's activities. But meanwhile, before I call on our next speaker to give us a welcome address, I would like to advise all participants, please switch off your cameras. Once you're connected, please switch off your cameras and just listen in and allow only those who are making presentation to put on their cameras. Switch off your cameras. Please switch off your cameras. Thank you very much. Joseph and Co, please switch off your cameras. Now, in order to waste much time, the second welcome address will be provided by the Director, Financial Sector Development, African Development Bank. That's the person of Stefan Nalemtabi. Stefan Nalemtabi, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Moses. And as Alhamdu, I think just to make sure that we don't take any risks on the quality of what you can hear, I'll turn off my video. So first of all, allow me to join Alhamdu and welcome you to this workshop. As Moses mentioned, my name is Stefan Nalemtabi, and I'm the Director for Financial Sector Development Department at the bank. As you might be aware, the devastating impacts of climate change is reshaping the nature of global economies. The physical risks posed by climate change are already impacting the value of assets. The impacts are particularly devastating in Africa due to our low adaptive capacity to climate change. We saw the impacts of the 2019 cyclones in Southern Africa, costing 2 billion and too many lives lost. We also witnessed the impacts of the locust invasion in East Africa. And some estimates suggest that locust-related losses, which include damage to crops, livestock, and others' assets, could add up to as much as $8.5 billion across East Africa and to the parts of Yemen. As more information about the physical risks of assets become available, financial institutions may become liable for assets that make losses due to climate impacts. Additionally, as countries across the world, including African countries, scale up efforts to fight climate change through legislation, policy and regulation, many sectors of the economy will face transition risks due to major shifts in the value of their assets or higher costs of doing business. And as companies make these shifts and become required to disclose more information relating to climate change, financial institutions will need to be able to assess climate risks in their lending operations. However, climate action in financial institutions does not just protect investments against physical and transition risks, they also present sustainable investment opportunities in renewable energy, energy efficiency, green transport, sustainable buildings, just to name a few of the sectors. There is also therefore an opportunity to access concessional climate finance from global climate funds for climate action. And as Alhamdu has mentioned, the bank is committing billions of dollars to climate investments, and we intend to commit 25 billion to climate investments over the next 5 years. So we're very much on board. Also, we're particularly pleased to inform you that our financial sector and climate change teams at the bank are working together to develop a $500 million climate facility to finance climate action in DFIs and SMEs. This facility will be extended to financial institutions on the continent, including yourselves, who will on-lend to climate-smart projects and SMEs on the continent. The facility will include technical assistance to both financial institutions and SMEs to develop sustainable governance frameworks and build a bankable pipeline of green investments. We hope to launch this facility at the latest early next year in the first quarter. Today, we begin a 3-day practical capacity development workshop. Participants who attend the totality of this workshop will leave with 4 takeaways from my perspective. The first one is a better knowledge of the risks that climate change poses to their investments. The second one is an understanding of how to use climate tools to identify those risks and mitigate them. Third one is an increased awareness of the investment opportunities that climate action presents. And finally, a better understanding of how to mobilize concessional climate finance for your lending operations. As Aiafd mentioned, this workshop builds on the work of the Africa Financial Alliance on Climate Change, AFAC, and Davina will provide you further details on the AFAC itself and its activities. Finally, I join Aiafd to encourage you to engage actively in the discussions. I am sure this will be a very informative and engaging workshop for you all, and wish you all the best, and I'll try and join you as long as possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stefan. That was a good one. Once again, I can see that participant has increased significantly. We're having about 172 participants. But once again, I want to appeal to some of us who still have our cameras on to switch off our cameras, please. If your camera is on, please switch it off and allow only those who are presenting have their cameras on if they really need to. Thank you very much. So our third welcome speech will be taken by the AADFI Assistant Vice President. And that's a person who is also the Managing Director of Uganda Development Bank. I call on Patricia Ojangole. Patricia Ojangole, please, you have the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Moses. I'll also just briefly turn on my camera, and then you'll allow me to turn it off as I make the remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Stefan Naletambi, Mr. Alamadu, distinguished participants, it's indeed my pleasure to welcome you and to present the opening remarks on this very important workshop. The agenda to mainstream climate finance in DFI's operations is an action that, as an association, we have given prime attention. As we know, climate change poses major global risks that have cross-border ramifications. Its impact can likely be equated to the coronavirus pandemic because the negative effect has no boundaries. Nevertheless, climate change also holds opportunities for financial institutions, particularly for DFIs. According to a publication by Alliance Group and the Worldwide Fund for Nature, the financial industry has a twofold responsibility on climate change. On the one hand, it needs to prepare itself for the negative effects that climate change may have on its business and on its customers. And on the other hand, it can significantly help mitigate the economic risks and enter the low carbon economy by providing appropriate products and services. But what are some of the gaps in addressing climate finance issues? One of them is the issues around funding. It has been envisaged that coordination and financing could remain a challenge in the process of achieving the Paris Agreement. Already, the cost of Africa's adaptation to climate change was estimated in the range of $10 to $30 billion a year by 2030. The World Bank has also estimated that between 2010 and 2050, the annual cost for adaptation to climate change in sub-Saharan Africa would be at least $18 billion, excluding funding necessary to place sub-Saharan African countries on a low carbon development pathway. Despite these huge funding requirements, it is a consensus that the level of financing currently reaching African countries is nowhere near enough. This was one of the conclusions at our Aadfi workshop in 2018, and I'm sure that the position has not changed for the better. So for us in Africa, and particularly for the national DFIs to contribute significantly in addressing the climate challenges and harnessing the opportunities, the funding issue has to be solved. The other challenge is in the area of skills requirement on climate finance, which we find lacking in most of our national DFIs and would need to be urgently addressed through scaling up capacity building in this field. Let me reiterate that Aadfi's position highlighted during the 2020 workshop on the need for proper synergy among key national actors and stakeholders in ensuring that African countries' nationally determined contributions are realized. In most instances, the national DFIs are not integrated in the processes. We are aware of the African Financial Alliance on Climate Action, Climate Change, an initiative of the Africa Development Bank. The Aadfi is therefore looking at being an active partner of this initiative so that we can work closer in addressing the climate agenda issues on our continent through our national development banks. I'll conclude with the words of the FDB President, Dr. Adesina, that Africa's financial actors need to work together creatively to mobilize global financial resources at scale that can support local innovation that drives climate resilient and low carbon development on the continent. Having been shortchanged by climate change, Africa must not be shortchanged by climate finance. I thank the Africa Development Bank President, the Africa Development Bank President for the partnership with the Association of African DFIs, and together we shall join hands in pushing the climate finance agenda forward. With those remarks, I wish all the delegates a fruitful session. Thank you all for listening to me. Over to you, Moses.
Thank you very much, Patricia. That was a very great speech. And once again, the national DFIs who are represented here today, you can see how important your presence is in terms of organizing this workshop, how the African developers take your contribution very serious. So it's your show for the next 3 days. We encourage you to be full participants. And please remember that you are free to send in your questions, either on the chat or from the email that was sent to you earlier, the email address that was sent to you earlier for you to share your questions. Please don't wait till we have our interactive section. Anything that comes into your mind during this period, you are free to begin to share them and responses will be provided as we go along. Now, we'll quickly take before we go to our section 1 for today's workshop, I would like to call on the Chief Executive Officer of National Agro Capita, Dr. Eugene Itwa, to just say some few things, and then we can now move quickly to the next listing. Dr. Eugene Itwa, please.
Thank you very much, Moses, and ladies and gentlemen. Just in addition to what has been said so far, to welcome everyone and indeed to thank everyone for being part of this. We look forward to a very rich program, and indeed, we look forward to your active participation in the course of the program. Once again, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Itwa. And without wasting our time, I know our IT team, they have queued, if not our presenter, who is a climate governance expert. and he's a professor. He will be taking us on module 1 today. And that module 1 is conceptualizing Africa. We're looking at the science and the politics of climate change. So Professor Chukwumerije Okereke, a climate governance expert from National Eco Capita, will be taking us on this module. Prof, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Moses. Can I have permission to share my screen, or have the IT people from AfDB share their screen, my slides? I would prefer if I'm able to share, but I'm also quite happy to have the slides shared. At the moment, I'm not able to share.
Prof, you can share your screen if you have it. You can share your screen. If not, we may have to do it from the back end.
I would prefer to share, but I'm disabled at the moment.
Okay, you are disabled at the moment. From the IT, can we share Professor Chukwumerije Okereke's screen, please?
Thanks, Moses. He's been given permission now.
Okay, let me try again. Yes. And following the tradition of the other distinguished speakers, I would like to switch off my camera as well to see if you can increase bandwidth. Okay. So thank you, distinguished delegates, and thank you, our hosts at the African Development Bank, for setting the context so beautifully well. It has been made clear that the aim of the 3-day workshop is to discuss how we can mainstream our climate finance in national development plans. But in the wisdom of the organizers, they have thought it necessary for us to start with just conceptualizing climate change and nationally determined contribution, looking at the science and politics interface. Everything in life is almost political. And by understanding more broadly the background of the science, but also the politics of the negotiation of the Paris Agreement and the nationally determined contribution, it is hoped that participants will go away with a richer understanding of how we came to where we are, but also how the NDCs opens up opportunities for investment, but also poses risks for the activities of many of the private sectors and our larger continent broadly. So I will provide a quick overview of the global context of climate change governance. I will focus on the UNFCCC, which is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Then I will talk a little bit about the science and politics of the negotiation of the Paris Agreement. I'll drill down a little bit more into the NDC, and I will end up by hinting at some of the risks and opportunities that are implicated by the NDC, knowing that subsequent presentations will go into much more depth on those. When we talk about the governance of climate change at the UNFCCC, we try to make it clear that even though the United Nations Framework Convention is the overarching or maybe the biggest theater of climate change governance, it is not the only place. Climate change is governed at a number of other spaces and platforms. But for this presentation, we are focusing on the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change because that is where the NDC stems from. Very quickly, in terms of the science of climate change, we know that the Earth is warming. It is warming primarily because the atmosphere traps some of the emissions that come from the sun and radiates these emissions, creating a cloud of what we call greenhouse gas. If you look to the right side of my screen, you will see that scientists have observed a growing a concentration of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide is not the only greenhouse gas, but it is chief of the greenhouse gases. Other greenhouse gases will include methane, for example, and NOxes. Historical observation shows that the concentration of the greenhouse gases has been increasing. You can see at the bottom of my screen where the x-axis joined the y-axis that in 1960, it was just about 315 parts per million in concentration. And by the time you get to 2010, 2010 is grown to nearly 400 parts per million. The main difference between climate change and weather is that weather is what you can see at the moment, or maybe tomorrow, or even next year. But climate change is the average weather over a long period of time. And it happens so subtly, so minutely, little by little, that often people may not be conscious and immediately aware of its consequences. But over time, it accumulates and it can have very devastating impact. The main sources of these greenhouse gas emissions, somebody has their Mohamed Toure. Mohamed Toure, can you switch off your microphone? Thank you. The main sources of these greenhouse gas emissions are industrial activities, energy, transport, but also what we call AFOLU, which comprises land use, forestation, deforestation, raising of animals, and all of those. If you look to the left of my screen, you will see an average representation of the various sectors and their contribution to global greenhouse. The key thing I want you to bear in mind at this stage is that these greenhouse gas emissions result from people, countries trying to better their lives. It is a result of economic activities. And this is important because you have set up your businesses wanting primarily to make profit, but also to contribute to the development of your countries. But it is often these developmental activities, if not properly managed, that give rise to the growth of the greenhouse gas, which will in turn, again, if care is not taken, come back to cause some consequences. Now, nobody is interested so much in gases or temperatures increasing in the atmosphere. The reason people are interested in the accumulation of these greenhouse gases is because they make bad things to happen. So as Stefan and other, Patricia and others have said, you can see that there are so many bad things that are associated with the increasing concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere resulting to climate change. So we can have the failure of crops, we can have hunger as a result, we can have a sea level rise, we can have impact on the economy, we can have the extinction of species We can have extremely hot weather causing people to die. We can have parts of Africa and other parts of the world submerged because of flooding and other types of extreme weather events. Now, what the work we have done in the IPCC shows that historically, from 1960 to date, human beings have already caused the temperature to increase on the average of 1 degree. And the work shows that there has to be a huge radical decrease in emissions if we want to stay or to stay within the target of 1.5 or 2 degrees centigrade, which is the target set by the Paris Agreement. So this means that there has to be changes in the way that we do business, changes in the way we transport. You saw all those, the circle I showed you before, all those areas, industrial activity, transport, agriculture, housing, all of those areas that contribute to the rise in emission, there has to be significant changes in the way we do things in those areas to be able to stay on the path that will not cause the planet to be completely made uninhabitable by climate change. However, this is where the politics comes in. It is not always easy to agree these targets. It's not also easy to agree what it is that we need to do. Even the understanding of what the problem is can be very, very hard to agree. And I want to go into a little bit of that into that in more detail. But before, let me just give you a bit of a context of the key areas of climate diplomacy, because the way that these things have been agreed have implications for Africa and implications for your business. The first area is the science and agenda setting, where we talked about, is climate change happening or not? How can we prove it? And of course, there are people who are still debating, no, it's not happening. But the science is now clear from the work of the IPCC that this is happening. So when you go back to your homes, don't let any customer tell you that you've wasted your 3 days here. There is no such thing as climate change. It is happening. You need to take the position that I will fortify my business against the risk of climate change because it is happening. And many of the steps that you will take to fortify your business against the risks of climate change will be win-win opportunities, so that, assuming in the probability that it didn't happen, you will still be able to make profit and keep your business alive. So we now have institutionalized the science of climate change through primarily the work of the IPCC, and that led to the creation of what we call the climate agreement or climate regime. Now, the first climate regime that was created is the UNFCCC, as I have indicated. And then that was in 1992. Then in 1997, it was strengthened through the creation of the Kyoto Protocol. And as the Kyoto Protocol was supposed to elapse around 2012, we began to try to create what we call the post-2012 regime. And that's how we ended up with the Paris Agreement. And now the world is shaped by the Paris Agreement, and the future of our world depends on how the Paris Agreement is implemented. So this is what I already told you: the UNFCCC, the Kyoto Protocol, and the Montreal. These are the key ones. There are many in between. And then the Bali. And of course, we had the Copenhagen, which didn't quite go well. And I will tell you why in a moment. But it was eventually salvaged in the Cancun. Then we went to Durban, Doha, Warsaw, Lima, and the Paris Agreement. Now, why did the Copenhagen, why was there a big problem in Copenhagen? This is interesting because the key challenge in Copenhagen was there was a fight between the developing countries and the developed country. And Africa played a major role in that diplomatic fight. There were some people who wanted to bring the ad hoc working group of the Kyoto Protocol and the ad hoc working group on term action on climate change together so that we can create something like this Paris Agreement. And the developing countries, including Africa, didn't want that to happen. They wanted something like the Kyoto Protocol to be renewed and to have a separate agreement that covers the developing countries. So in negotiating a climate change, you see several blocks. You see, but to make it easy for us, let's just say that it is often divided into developed and developing countries. In the developed country side, you have mostly the US and the umbrella group, the environmental integrity, and the European Union. And in the developing country, you have mostly the OCs, the LDC, which means the least development group, and then you have African group. When we started, Africa used to negotiate, or the G77 and China used to negotiate and become a very powerful group. But increasingly, that marriage is beginning to become weak as China has, advanced in its development and often finds that it takes a different position from that of African and the LDCs. By the way, the LDCs are mostly African. About 42 or so of the 48 LDC countries are in Africa. Now, I will jump this. But the key questions that the politics is often like, who should organize and conduct the negotiation? The developed countries were thinking we need a technical body to do this, and the developing countries were saying, no, we need the UN system to do it. And you can see the quote from Pakistani negotiators saying that the UN system permits everybody to be able to have equal say in the agreement, the kind of agreement that is going to be negotiated. So definitely, eventually, the developing countries won that debate, and that's how we created the UNFCCC. Now, there was also the question as to whether we will have a target-based protocol or a framework convention. And what eventually happened was that we had a framework convention in 1992 and eventually a target-based protocol in 1997. But the big debate, and this should interest you, is the debate as to what should be the focus of the regime that is to be created. Developing countries felt it has to be a regime that takes care of development and climate change or the environment. Whereas many in the developed country were saying, no, we need to focus specifically on removing carbon and mitigation. But eventually, developing countries won the argument, and that's how we came to this ultimate objective of the convention that talks about removing managing the concentration of greenhouse, but also doing that in a way that allows, the ecosystem and natural, the system, food production, and not to threaten economic development. So the AfDB has not brought you here to ask you to take any action that will threaten your businesses. No, the idea is to fashion your business to be able to withstand the regime and the global transition that is going to be taking place, the global green transition. But also there was a key controversy about who should take responsibility. And I know that many of you in our interaction have been saying, I don't want to take any action that will cost me money. I have limited money to run my business. I think is a legitimate concern that you are raising, because who pays for the emission was a big debate and continues to be a big debate, because Africa did not cause climate change, but we are enduring the impact of it. And so there are several fairness or justice implications. And this continues to be a big politics that characterizes the UNFCCC and the negotiation. And finally, there is the big question about how to divide between prevention, which is the mitigation, and cure, which is adaptation. And this also continues to be a tension that you find in the UNFCCC, with Africa often feeling that adaptation has not been given enough emphasis. And that is why I'm delighted that the bank, as you can see or hear from those presentations, have a big emphasis on adaptation, including through domiciling the African Adaptation Initiative, which I led the creation of as the PI, but also now the Global Adaptation Forum, which has been created and domiciled also in the bank. So the bank is clear that, in my understanding, that emphasis have to be equally on mitigation and adaptation. Okay. Now, although the developing countries won a lot of all those kind of diplomatic victories, US was not happy. The US said that nobody with their right mind should expect that climate regime should treat China like Sub-Saharan Africa and exclude 50 developing countries with a high per capita income from taking steps. And although the Kyoto Protocol was signed, the US failed to ratify it and never really joined the Kyoto Protocol. So as I already explained, there was the challenge of how do we create a new regime that will preserve the differences between the developed and developing countries, but also make sure that all countries are doing a little bit of what they can in order to address climate change. And this is how we came to Paris and negotiated the NDC. So the key outcome of the Paris Agreement was that it allowed sort of voluntarism because originally in the Kyoto Protocol, countries were given what we call quantified emission reduction obligations. But now countries are allowed to write their own nationally determined contribution, which kind of tells bottom up and decides what it is that they are willing to do to tackle climate change. Now, the implication for you is that the type of NDC your countries write is partly dependent on you. You can influence the focus or the foci of your country's NDC by networking with the right people in authority. It also means that there is a greater opportunity to link the NDCs with your development plans and business prospects and opportunities, but also to make the NDC to recognize where you are heading, where the risks are, and cause the country to have focus in helping to mitigate that risk. Now, I won't go into all the other areas such as strong ambition, wide scope, but I just wanted to make sure that we understand the history of the creation of the NDC. Now, a key part of the new regime that is linked to the NDC is the monitoring, reporting, and verification. So by the time you go home at the end of the 3 days, you have a good understanding of how to protect yourself. We talked about building pipelines. This is that because we want people to be able to verify what they say that they have done. That's why you have that control on top of the voluntarism. So it's not purely voluntaristic because we have to monitor and measure and verify what we say that we are doing. Now, the NDCs are important tools in fighting climate change, but there are still some challenges because the totality of the pledges made by countries still fall far short of what is required or what scientists say is required to keep the average temperature from rising above 1.5 or 2 degrees. And so there is need to still ratchet up ambition. And many African countries, as we speak, are in the process of revising their NDCs. So make sure that you know where your country is in its NDC revision and the role that you could play in helping to guide that revision to serve your purpose. Now, to understand how we came to an agreement that some African countries felt was not fair because it now puts everybody in the same basket and asks everybody to write their nationally determined contribution and breaks the wall between the developed and developing countries, as it were. the reason is because when Copenhagen failed, there was an outcry and people said, oh, we need to bring this regime together, and people were quite, countries of different types were sort of a bit willing to make concession. But also the US, through Obama, went and struck a deal, a bilateral relationship and deal with China, and they said, we're going to try and revive this. China was building an equivalent of about 1 coal-fired power station or 2 coal-fired power stations every week, and there was a sense of understanding that given the investment that China had made in the area of renewable, that they were willing to now come to the table and negotiate a stronger deal. But also, there was the emergence of a high ambition coalition that wanted to put everybody in the same basket. Price of oil was falling, and crucially, there was a new climate economics that was making the argument that, you know what, you can actually make profit, or at least not lose money by taking climate action, by connecting, for example, clean air with health. Obama it was the last year of Obama's presidency, and he was keen to ensure that the Paris Agreement did not fail. And also the French government did a lot of shuttle diplomacy, helping African countries and then many other developing countries to craft their INDC even before the agreement, the negotiation started. And of course, there was a Paris terrorist attack that happened a few weeks before that, and then also a strong support from the business communities. All of these things created the atmosphere that led to the negotiation of the nationally determined contribution, which, as I said, broke the wall between the developed and developing countries and mandates every country, poor, rich, developed and undeveloped, to come up with a pledge on what they can do to fight climate change. So this is where we are. But of course, the issue of justice remains important. The average emission of a US citizen is many, many times more than the average emission of an average African. Africa has contributed the least, but we are suffering the greatest impact. But we cannot continue to complain. The onus is on us to find ways of protecting ourselves, but also leveraging the pots of money in the Global Green Climate Fund, GCF, and all other facilities to be able to leapfrog our development to the green path. And also, developed countries have some points, because if you consider the totality of the emissions that have happened from 1750 to now, it's actually interesting that over the bulk of the emissions has happened in the last 40 years, has actually been mostly from developing countries. So they argue that by excluding Africa and other developing countries from the deal will mean that the deal is dead on arrival and that we cannot stop climate change. So you can see that 1,100 gigatons of carbon released it has actually been released in the last 40 years. So nearly half, or slightly more than half, of the total cumulative amount of carbon in the atmosphere has actually been emitted in the last 40 years. And I think China and fastly developing countries have mostly responsible for this. So this is why Africa cannot continue to say, we cannot do anything. But our choice now is to turn this into some kind of advantage to protect our businesses, protect our countries, and make sure that we are not allowing the global transition to catch us sure-footed. There is also, of course, a big challenge with the rich and the poor, both in the developed and the developing countries. So we know, for example, that the 10 richest people in the world account for nearly half of the total emissions, and the 50% of the poorest people account for less than 10%. So there is also a rich-poor divide in the emission profile globally. But Africans according to the Maple-Croft Index, 6 of the top most vulnerable countries in the world are African countries. And there is a need for us to take climate change seriously, to protect our investment and our country. And then the final point is also about the negotiation. Many African countries are outnumbered in the climate diplomatic political circle. I got my PhD student, one of my PhD students, to count the numbers, and you can see going back 2000 and up to 2010, you can see the huge disparity in the number of delegates that developed countries send to the UNFCCC compared to the ones that come from Africa. So if you take Ethiopia and Germany, for example, roughly 80 million each, you can see 2000, 75.5, 56.3, 54.3, 62.0, and on you go. And the problem that this creates is that it often means that African countries are not able to effectively project their voices in what to make the regime to reflect their needs. Now, as I begin to round off, let us look specifically at the mitigation.
So, Prof, yes? Yeah, please round off. Yeah.
Okay. So let us look very briefly.
Round off.
Okay. Let us look briefly at the mitigation and the adaptation challenge. The biggest mitigation challenge we have is that half of Africa, more than half of Africa, is still in darkness with very, very limited connection to modern electricity. So there is the challenge of how do we reduce our emissions while also growing our economy and primarily ensuring universal energy access to all. And if you look at our energy mix, you can see that the bulk of it still comes from biofuel and fossil fuel. And these are the source of energies that have been condemned to die in the future as global climate change takes its root. So a big challenge for Africa is how do we ensure an energy transition without exacerbating our emission profile. Now, there has been a huge growth in renewable energy, but the total installation and a percentage remains very, very poor. And then the second big challenge is that even if we do nothing, the main sources of our fuel, which is oil, could actually be signed out of existence, and that will leave us very vulnerable. And then the big adaptation challenge, as I've already indicated, is a huge amount of the impact that we can bear and that we're already bearing and its effect on our economy. These are the top priorities for adaptation for African countries based on the report commissioned by the African Development Bank, which I led on. And as previous speakers have said, money remains an issue, but also that of capacity building. So I hope that as you go into the rest of the discussion today, you can go into much depth about these issues, but that I set the broad political context that will help you to understand how the NDC was formed and the financial and risk implications of NDC for African countries and businesses. Thank you very much.
Moses?
I'm sorry about that. I had a little bit of connection issues, and I'm back. The second model presentation, and this will be taken by Dr. Eugene Itwa.
Please, if you could just give me.
Itwa will be handling this, and he will be talking about understanding environmental, social, and governance. Understanding environmental, social, and governance, and the ESG issues. And
please, could you just give me an opportunity to share? IT. Please, could you give me the opportunity? The IT. IT support, please, could you give me the opportunity?
We hear you, we hear you.
Yeah, you hear me, but the IT doesn't appear to hear me. Fade, please, could you reach out to the person?
Yes, go ahead, sir.
I will also take off my video so that we can conserve the. I will quickly, because we seem to be losing time, I will run through what I have that you are quite familiar with already. It is given that a number of organizations today seem to be driving their system based on ESG. As you can see on the slides, there have been significant increase in flows in this mandate. And of course, to a number of institutions, it has become an issue of priority. And indeed, for the financial institutions, a number of them are already assessing and indeed have been assessed with regard to their financial soundness of funds using ESG. And of course, looking at it from how resilient their companies could be, their system is running, and so on and so forth. And indeed, the long-term challenges in relation to the investment. But the question is, how do we view ESG matter in our organization? So much has been said by Prof and other speakers in relation to climate change, but generally now, looking at the entire issues of ESG, how do we see it? I want us to take a poll in doing this. So I'll stop this and then we take a poll on how we view ESG in our facility. Please kindly pull out this meti.com and then use this code. We're going to do this a couple of times, and I encourage all of you to pull out this. use this code. And then let's see what your response could be. As much as possible, we will not want to waste so much time. This session will be interactive in this manner. Great, people already coming in. Yes, please go ahead. Is it a PR tactic? Is it a major marketing strategy? Or is it just, oh, feeling good about the exercise? And do you see it from the corporate angle? We have as many as 173 participants here. And from what we have here, we have just less than 30 who have done this. Please. So from what we can see here, a number of us are seeing this as a corporate strategy, and indeed as part of your policy agenda. That is what the majority of you are saying. Of course, we have few that have said it's a PR tactic. So in other words, could it be what we're seeing here is the level of consideration your organization is giving to ESG? Well, this speaks for itself. Now, ladies and gentlemen, one more thing. We have seen that a large number of us are seeing this as strategy that we want to deal with, and indeed is part of our corporate policy. That is what a number of us have said here. I agree with you. That is how it should be. It's not an issue of PR today. It's not an issue of, oh, it's a marketing strategy or feeling good, but more of a strategy that a number of organizations are seen to be relevant to their survival. Another question that we want to look at is, for your operation, is it wholesale lending or direct lending? What are your, would you rate this in relation to ESG? If we give a poll, you will also see how it flows. Now let's do that. Now, in doing this, you would have noticed that a number of us, like I've said, seem to believe that we should see that from the dimension of different angles without really putting what the public is demanding today, the societal expectation in mind. One other question I want to give in this ever-changing economic environment, do you think organizations that take ESG seriously significantly outperform their peers? Your responses likely will be yes. I have more questions. To what degree is your organization interested in the way a company you deal with manages our ESG risk. I will run through this in order to save time, because I've been notified that we're already going beyond our time. One more question here. What are the risks and opportunities created for financial institutions? You already know this. A number of us know this, and that is why you have seen it as part of your corporate agenda. One more question. How do you assess your portfolio exposure to ESG risk? How do you do this? It is of relevance in assessing and indeed in taking on portfolios. The manner and way you assess determines how exposed you could be. And in assessing your portfolios, in assessing your clients, do you always have enough information? This is also one of the fundamental questions we consider relevant. Based on interaction with some of you. Now, it is generally known that whether directly or indirectly, you are all exposed to ESG risk. Indirectly, of course, through your lending activity, your investment activity. Directly, your operations. So you cannot just say it is for others. It is for everyone. But what is ESG? Based on this definition I pulled out from somewhere, it's a set of standards that indicate the ethical impact and sustainable practices of an entity. So in this regard, your own institution. But why is this still relevant? We have said a couple of things in this regard, but the question still remains, why does ESG matter to financial institutions? We've seen directly it relates to you. We've also seen indirectly it relates to you. PwC said this, that even for you to be sustainable is relevant, and that it should be part of the DNA of a financial institution. Is it from the angle of investment strategy, credit decision, or to risk management, or even reporting? ESG has come to be a hallmark of sustainable financing. For instance, because AfDB has seen this to be so, it has declared as a leading development finance institution, environmental, social, and governance issues rank very high on our corporate agenda. And it goes on to say, particularly in a time of resource constraints and rising social pressures, with public and private organizations facing an increased need for a strong approach to ESG integration in their operations. And so, looking at the issues of long-term investment, resilience, and so on and so forth, we have seen that AfDB is taking the lead in this, based on what is professed here. Now, for ESG, we've talked about ESG, ESG, ESG. The E there is the environmental factors. The S is the social factor, and the G is the governance factor. And when you look at the environmental factor, we'll be talking about climate change since. That is one of it. The waste we generate, That is part of it. What are those things that have bearing on the environment that will make some level of impact? They are part of the environmental factors. And then for social, are you looking at issues of inclusion, diversity, human rights? Just name it. They are all part of the social factor that we want to give attention to. Your internal policies, your controls, your measures. How transparent is your board? All of these are part of the governance factors. Again, for AfDB, it says that for environmental issues, we need to mainstream environmental sustainability in all our operations. We will champion climate resilience and low carbon development in Africa, looking at environmental factors alone. It has also said, for social issues, we will demonstrate a strong commitment to improving social conditions on the continent. Inclusive participation with stakeholders is also of relevance. How do we ensure good governance? Internally, externally, and indeed, how can we be a preferred employer in Africa and indeed in the world? That is part of the governance aspect of the ESG of AfDB. A number of you here, and indeed, if not all, you have yours as well. But otherwise, can we start? Can we develop something? That is the way to go. Now, we are talking about climate risk. It's also part of what you are facing today. So we need to align with what Professor Chuksa said earlier. And indeed, for those that are aligning, what are they doing? Reorientating their financial instrument products or portfolios away from non-consistent activities or scaling up consistent activities. As the alignment determines how much and by when should green transition in our brown activities be developed or financed. So we need to realign our structure with this. Climate risk. And indeed, for us to be able to do it more effectively, we're here today having this workshop. The approach, the AfDB is supporting the development and indeed has supported the development of climate opportunities and risk screening tool, focusing on the SMEs. It has also developed business carbon footprint. And especially for the financial institutions, guidance note for mainstreaming climate change in lines of credit. And of course, all of these will create jobs, green jobs. How do we ensure we're able to document and monitor them and track them? Then you have the tracking tool, the green job tracking tool that has been developed as well. But take notes in all of this. What we want with the goal has already been stated. The Paris Agreement objective. Different scenarios are being built, but even when these are built, you want to give attention to your own client. That is the key focus for you. And of course, the provision of financing or investment for such, once you have been able to screen the portfolio with all the needed pathway that you need to follow to bring this on board. And for those that have actually taken this as a solution, there are achievements. We have asked this question earlier. Those that have taken this on board, do they perform higher? From what you have seen here, certainly they do. When a company performs well on ESG criteria, it is often a key indicator that it is well managed overall. That is what Allen and Overy had said. In fact, it shows that they are prepared to manage the terrible situations or predictable situation we have today, and likely to perform better financially over time. We talked about the resilience of your institution earlier. The bottom line, cost reduction. That you will certainly benefit from. Growth facilitation, you will attract new businesses. And the regulatory burden is also there. You will avoid it. People will be so happy to work in your organization. We have seen that from AfDB's own. And indeed, we want to optimize investments and capital expenditure.
So I think
who is interested in your performance?
Dr. Itwa, please round up.
Investors, government, the general public. So in raising the bar, you need to take a careful stock of all ESG issues and dimensions in a holistic fashion. With that, you'll be able to take in the climate risk, another risk that you have not really given attention to. And for you to further do this, you want to assess, you want to develop and commit more of your resources. Ladies and gentlemen, you want to continue to educate those who associate with you, internally and externally, and of course, you want to track and report all your activities. You want to continue to maintain your performance so that you will be the choice of all of us that are interested in seeing ESG performance and how they relate to what you do. Ladies and gentlemen, in ensuring compliance and long-term value creation, there are a whole lot of things you need to do. You want to strike the right balance, strike the right balance in relation to the risk you would have assessed yourself against. Of course, you want to translate the ESG strategy into the organization's ecosystem. The long and short of it is that you should be able to collect, manage, and use ESG data for your risk modeling. When you do all of this, and indeed other ones that have been applied here, certainly you'll be a top performer. Ladies and gentlemen, these are the must do. You want to understand that ESG is beyond label. You want to include this in your investment cycle. You want to train the people that work with you, and of course, others that associate with you, like AfDB is doing now. ESG data, you want to continue to pull this to enrich your resources. In terms of communication, let everyone know what you are doing, and indeed integrate ESG in your risk management framework. When we do all of this, certainly we would have supported the African continent, where we have businesses in terms of population being the ASMS. We have not less than 90% as SMEs rather. So ladies and gentlemen, ESG is supposed to manage out the risk that you face. Would you continue to invest in it? Certainly, we encourage you to continue. You would have supported all of us in Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Eugene. Our time is fast spent. We move immediately to the interactive section, and this will take, maybe we'll have about 10, 13 minutes for this. Professor Chukwumerije Okereke and Dr. Eugene Ichwa will be handling this session. So you have the floor, and let's move quickly to the interactive session. Thank you very much. And please, you should also check, Prof. I think there are some questions for you on the chat. So also Dr. Eugene, as we make progress on this, please also try to respond to some of those questions. Thank you very much.
The third session is not happening then?
No, Louis, yours, there will be, after this, there will be a 5 minutes break. Then the module 3, which is the one you are taking, will come up.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. So we are moving to the interactive section. And from what I've seen here, one of the questions that were asked earlier, participants going to be given some of the workshop materials. This question came from Lola Visamba-Bukuje. Yes, Lola, I'm sure the bank is going to respond as we make progress on this, but if you've registered properly, I'm sure access will be granted later to some of these materials. So, Dr. Eugene, Professor Chukwumerije, you have the floor.
Yeah, if what we will quickly say here is let participants send their questions through the chat box and then we take them on. You saw what we're working against in terms of trying to share. But of course, if you want them, if your ground rule is to leave them to talk, please, it's your call. But what we want to say here is let's us quickly insert our questions in the chat box there, and then we can take them on. Otherwise, we have a session, an interactive session later on. Since the time is fast spent, we can move on to the very next one, and then we take all the questions then.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Eugene. Professor Chukwumerije, please listen to this carefully before we move to the next presentation. There's a question here from one of the participants. I think that's Lola Visamba-Bukuje. She says, in the slide on greenhouse emission, Prof, listen very carefully. In the slide on greenhouse emissions by sector, 24% was said to be from their agric and other land use. What form of agric activities and examples of other land use activities that are principally responsible for greenhouse emissions? I take that question again, Prof. In the slide on greenhouse emissions by sector, 24% was said to be from agric and other land use. What form of agric activities and examples of other land use activities that are principally responsible for the greenhouse emissions? Over to you, Prof. Hello, Prof. We can't hear you.
I suggest you move on to the next one okay. So that, like I said earlier, we take all of them in due course.
Okay then.
The time is passing.
Yeah, thank you very much. So we prepare for module 3. Module 3 will be taken by Louis Pirot and is on climate change challenges and opportunities for the financial sector. Climate change challenges and opportunities for the financial sector. So, Louis, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Moses. I'd like to share my screen. Okay, can you all see it now?
Yes, I can. Yes, I can.
Okay, perfect. I'll put it on full screen if I can. Okay, perfect. Okay, so this session is on climate finance, and I'll sort of refocus the whole topic by starting on the climate. It's about the financial sector, And I refocus the whole subject on, by talking about climate finance and explaining the distinction between the two so that it's very clear to everyone, and giving some figures of how big they are, etc. And then we'll look at specifically about the challenges of the financial sector, the opportunities that climate change may form to it, and then the specificities of Africa and this the climate sectors within Africa. That graph is quite interesting. It shows what sort of amounts of money we would need to achieve this 1.5 degrees Celsius. Obviously, nothing is extremely accurate, but it gives a range. And as you can see, if we bundled up together all the amounts of finances that we put together currently, and we'll see where they come from in the slide after, we are very far from what we would need. And that explains the fact that at the moment we are not reaching the 1.5 degrees, and neither are we the 2 degrees. So climate finance, there's a definition here, there's many around, but it's basically any capital flows which targets low carbon and climate resilient developments. A large part of that would come from financial institutions and be channeled specifically by financial institutions, whether they're public or private. I suspect many of you might be quite familiar with this big graph, which is trying to understand where this climate finance is coming from. That's for 2017 to 18. Interesting to see that a big chunk of it comes from the public sector. That's still the case. And then we can, so that's the bottom up, the top bottom, sorry, the top section, which is in blue. And the rest is from the private sectors, whether it's corporates or directly from financial institutions. So that's the brownish color. And there's an orangey one from the households as well. The second column is, I feel, extremely interesting because quite often we associate climate change with a grant. Maybe I should turn off my camera actually. I don't know how to do that. And actually, the amount coming from grant is not that big. The lion's share of things is coming from debt, from loans, whether that's soft loans, that's 65 billions, or from market rate sort of loans. And those are landed either by public institutions or private financial institutions. And then you have balance sheets that's mostly for corporates. Yeah. The third column is extremely interesting as well, and you can see that most of it comes to finance mitigations, and a very small share is actually adaptation, which is obviously an extremely big issue. It's good to mitigate the problem, but the adaptations will most likely come first, actually currently coming first, and doing one without the other is counterproductive. This one repeats a bit, it's all the sources of finance. One interesting one in the middle is carbon markets. So that's another source of financing all those measures, whether there's, well, in this case, it's exclusively mitigation. Carbon markets, after the Kyoto Protocol disappeared with the COP in Copenhagen, have sort of died out a bit, but they've reappeared in many markets, many continents, countries around the globe, but there's no common carbon markets around the globe, and therefore it's sort of capped. It doesn't have the effect that it could potentially have. This slide gives you an idea private versus public. It's about a 50-50 give or take at this stage. 20% of the finance of the private finance, sorry, come from the financial institutions. That's important. We still have the imbalance between adaptation and mitigation. A big chunk, and we will see that again later on in the presentation, comes from energy. And only a very, very small bit, whether it's for mitigation or adaptation purpose, come from agriculture, which is a big issue for the African continent. Within the Paris Agreement, which was targeting 2 degrees, and the first presentation talked about how it was built up, and hoping for 1.5. It was ambitious. The main thing were ambitious actions, governmental policies, corporate actions, but also financial institutions actions. And that's very important, that it was a core component of the type of actions which I expected. The financial industry can prepare itself to the negative effects for its customers, businesses, whatever they finance. But also it has a leverage over the whole space and the economic space to gear things towards low carbon economy by providing appropriate products and services. I think I'll jump straight to the second bit in this slide. The sources of financial institutions, just to list them. I'm pretty sure all of you are very well aware of those. So there's the public financial institution, which AfDB is part of, whether they're multilateral, bilateral, development banks, dedicated funds from governments, or again from international sources. And they mostly provide debts, all those institutions, whether it's soft debts or market rates debts, and provide guarantees more and more. That's the case of, I don't know, the EIB, for instance, is trying to provide that in a big way. I know that the AfDB as well has that on their map. And in some cases, they can provide technical assistance when they touch financial matters. Then you have all the large private financial institutions, private banks, insurance companies, reinsurance companies, investment institutions, pension funds are enormous players, obviously, in this world. Then the smaller privates, venture capital, microfinance, microinsurance, which are extremely important in this part of the world, crowdfunding, etc. I miss. There's many others to come, obviously. Would be unfair not to mention the non-for-profit, which I call here with a mission, philanthropists, impact investing, NGO who are actually investing their own cash, and they are very important in many of the poorer countries of Africa. And then, as I mentioned before, the carbon finance space, which deserves to be singled differently from the others. Let's move on to the challenges now. There are 3 main categories. There's what we think about immediately, the direct physical impact on the businesses of those institutions. Then there's the transition, what we call the transition risk, which are all the impacts that policies and regulations as a result of climate change will have on the businesses of those financial institutions. And finally, what I've called here the macro impacts. We'll come back to those 3 in a minute. In terms of physical impact, as everyone can guess, the biggest victims are the insurance companies. They already have now to adapt to new, completely new market conditions for them. Whether they're for the insurance companies, but even more so at this stage for the reinsurance companies who are here to insure all the sort of the peak of the claims. And as you know, there's more and more peaks, and companies like to name the largest Swiss Re or Munich Re have teams working on climate change and see how they can adapt to that. And it's more and more the case of large international insurance companies as well, to have proprietary teams on climate change and see the trends, what's coming up, what they could try to do, and how they can tweak their products so that they don't go into financial difficulties themselves, etc. There's millions of examples, but I've just named one here. The British Insurance Association said that by 2050, the cost of weather claims will multiply by 5 to 6 folds. And in terms of extreme years, it may go up to 20 billions. Then obviously that's on the liability sides. Those institutions are impacted on their asset sides. They have to invest, as you all know, the money they receive from the premiums, and they have to do it appropriately, adequately, so that they still have enough money to face the liabilities when they come up. Obviously, if the assets get into troubles, then they're themselves in big troubles. And those investments are in stocks or in direct investments are at risk in sectors like infrastructure, agro-food, energy, mining, transportation, just to name a few. Something which is starting to appear, which has been mentioned by many financial institutions, are the issue with stranded assets. So that's an asset which was on the balance sheet at a certain cost. Let's talk about a coal power generation company, for instance, which runs out of business, and it's on the books at a certain value, and all of a sudden it's on the value of 0. And then there's a big issue around that, and with the switch to progressively more renewable energies and less fuel-based generation, then there will be more and more of those stranded assets. Yeah. The banks suffers as well, less than the insurance, but still they will, and they are already suffering in some parts of the world with the impact on the repayment rates for the money they lend. Again, the investment side of things, project finance is also an issue, and you get the stranded assets on the investment side, but also on the project finance side. Pension fund, obviously assets, they impacted on their investments, like their the first two that I mentioned, but also their fiduciary duty towards the scheme members. So they have a duty to invest their money adequately and responding to expectations towards climate change and other ESG criteria, and they are accountable to their pension members. So that's another dimension that they have to cope with. Investment houses, that's back to the investment issues. Important to know that, well, we'll talk about that later, sorry. Private equities, venture capital, and property investments, obviously, with all those weather unexpected events, the properties are obviously extremely impacted. Let's talk quickly about the transition risks now. The regulations will have a direct impact on the investment themselves, as whether it's ESG or other restriction that stock exchange and governments may put in place, whether it's nationally or internationally, will have a direct impact on how those financial institutions are allowed to invest or can invest, or that will dictate how quickly potential stranded assets will become stranded. The regulations are very, very big drivers of the value of the assets, and needs to be looked at very carefully. There's also what I would call sort of soft regulations, guidelines, which are issued by a number of organizations, whether they're international, sectorial, etc. I have named here the UNFFI, principles on responsible banking. There's also insurance guidelines issued by the same organizations. And thirdly, the peer pressure is extremely important as well, with all the sustainable goals that the company may have. When one company does one thing, their direct competitor needs to do the same thing, otherwise they are losing market share. And it's sort of a nice virtuous circle here between the in terms of pushing companies, large companies pushing to do the right thing. I've talked here about the disinvestments from coal companies. As you probably know, most large financial institutions now are announcing one after the other that they will not invest in coal power generations and coal mining and etc. That's the case of, I don't know, AXA, for instance, Allianz. That's the case of ING, it's case of HSBC. A lot of those large companies have made announcement of this kind of disinvestment. Finally, the macro impact. As you all know, climate change will have an enormous impact on the world, humanities, people, nature, and invariably have an enormous impact on the global economy, obviously, and that will in turn has an enormous impact on financial institutions. Okay. I just mentioned one last bit here. There's more and more what I would call climate change litigations, where actually a group of people, whether that's shareholders or members in a pension scheme, etc., are taking legal actions against the corporates if they feel that this corporates is failing to anticipate climate change. It's true to this appearance, I believe, in the US of that sort of thing to governments as well. But there's a few against corporations. One factor which is a challenge, which I wanted to mention here, which is extremely important for the insurance business, but also for the banking business and other financial institution businesses, is the issue of time horizons. Investments are for horizons of 1 to 5 years. The non-life insurance business is 1 year. Reinsurance business is 1 year. So when we contract is for 1 year and then we renew this contract. Most of the pension funds are giving instructions to their investment houses for 1, 2, 3, 5 years. Very, very seldom more than 5 years. And climate change, which is the elephant in the room, is an enormous impact, has a much longer term horizons. Therefore, how do you match one with the other is something which we have to grapple with, but currently it's a bit of an issue. Now let's move to the opportunities for climate change. Very often when we talk about climate change for financial institutions, we think about all those new investments which are available and made possible from climate change. One shouldn't forget that climate change is before anything a threat and a very big threat. And it's not a great opportunity for the world. It's a threat, yeah, before anything. So, but still, there are opportunities from this major change that the world and the financial services and sector will experience due to climate change. Opportunities are investments in climate-friendly technologies and energies, ESG funds, as we talked about, green bonds. I will talk more specifically about green bonds. I believe it may be interesting to some people. There's some smart, innovative insurance products, opportunity to for differentiation to do the right thing, and many others. Yeah, it's only naming a few here. There's a list here of what they may be: invest in energy efficiency, invest in renewable energies, making sure to have partnerships with developing in countries for transfer of technologies. Green bond, we're going to talk about it in a minute. Reducing the real estate emissions from energy use, to name just a few. Green bond is a category which has appeared only the graph starts from 2007, so it's only a few years back. It's basically earmarking raising money via bonds, whether it is treasury bonds or corporate bonds, for earmark those funds raised for climate friendly purposes, whether it's energy efficiency, renewable energy, low carbon transport, green buildings, smart grids, and etc. As you can see, it has, as one would expect, it went from nearly zero in 2007 to 1 trillion today. So it's an enormous increase. Obviously, some of what was invested in 2007 wasn't earmarked yet, so it's a bit biased here. However, there's a big trend here which is extremely important. So then there's the three circles here, which shows where those are invested. So proceeds are mostly in energy, buildings, transports. The part of the world, as you can see, Africa at this stage is still below 1%. And then how they're spread and the sources of those issuance are fairly well spread between what we would see as potential issuers. This graph is trying to summarize all the leverages that climate finance can have, and how you're best combining public funds with private funds. There's, as you know, there's very big public funds focusing on climate change. The biggest one today is the Green Climate Fund, based in Korea. The World Bank, with all the JEFs, is an enormous pocket of money as well. Large countries like Germany, the US, France, and others are deploying a lot of money towards climate change. And what's important, I think, is how you can leverage this money so that it produces a maximum effect. If it's solely via grants, you won't go very far. However, if this money is used to leverage, whether it's for lending, providing guarantees, or allowing for the rates to be a bit lower, etc., then or direct equity as well. They can help with making direct equity less risky. Within all those leverages, then you're able to maximize the investments in fixed income, in listed equity, in SMEs, in real estates, in project finance, in commodities, in forestry, agriculture, all those climate-friendly investments. So I won't go through this diagram in details. That's I myself designed it, and it took me quite a while actually to get my head around it. Let's move on now to the particular case of Africa.
Lois,
yeah,
Lois, I
I'll
think we should be rounding off. Yeah, please.
Sorry, sorry.
Just 5 minutes.
Yeah. So within Africa, as we've seen before, it's a very vulnerable continent. It's very vulnerable for all the weather events, but also because it doesn't have the developments and the infrastructure and the governance yet fully in place to face the challenges that climate change is coming. And as you all know, agriculture is a very important sector in Africa. In some countries, it's a livelihood, a matter of livelihood, and climate change has a direct impact on the agricultural sector. Disorderly in urbanization is also a big issue. Financial sector is of modest size compared to the other parts of the world, but it's growing very fast at the moment and experiences its own development with mobile finance, with finance towards financing the poor. Opportunities, there's an enormous untapped opportunities for renewable energies in Africa. The emissions are very low. However, that's an opportunity for a clean, sustainable development to go directly to renewable energies, especially with the enormous potential that you have. Agriculture also, climate change sort of make agriculture, although it's a bit weird to say that, but it makes agriculture an opportunity. Because you need to be smarter on the methods. You need to find ways to rationalize and recover and restore lands. Infrastructure development is a must for the adaptations, and therefore that's an opportunity. And a cleaner and greener industrialization is very important. 2 words on climate bonds. So there's an increasing number of them in Africa. There's been some in South Africa, in Kenya, in Morocco, in Nigeria, coming up in Egypt and Ghana. The amounts are still a bit modest, but there's a trend there, and there's a definite opportunity, and I think the AfDB is well aware of that. There's a great opportunity to raise more money towards climate change mitigation and adaptation via those green bonds. In conclusions, climate change cannot be ignored, and a business as usual attitude is not possible. Working with governments is extremely important for those financial institutions. Extremely important to set up targets towards fulfilling international agreements. And need to adapt to international processes to there's an echo, I guess, have been cut. Yeah, and then adapt the investments to the mitigation and adaptation. Thank you very much. So, sorry to have gone over a bit.
Yeah, thank you very much, Lloyd. You did a very great job. I just would like to appeal to our participants that we just have 2 more presentations for today. And after that, we'll take a roundup, and we'll be closing for today's sessions. But we are moving very fast. The reason is that our time is fast spent, and we know that sometimes listening attention sometimes can be shortened if we continue to sit and listen. Now, our next presentation, which will last for about 20-25 minutes, is from David Carlin. David Carlin is taking Module 4. And in Module 4, David will be talking about climate risk financial disclosures. Climate risk financial disclosures, guidance for African financial institutions. Climate risk financial disclosures, guidance for African financial institutions. David, you have the floor. 20-25 minutes, please, you through. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much for having me. I see in the comments some people are asking for maybe a quick break, so I'll offer that to the organizers if you'd like us to do that. Very glad to pick up in a few minutes. Otherwise, I'm very happy to begin sharing my slides now. So
thank you, David. Thank you, David. We will do 5 minutes break. In 5 minutes time from now, we will return. So those of us who want to probably ease ourselves, stretch our legs a bit, please, you have about 5 minutes to do that. and then David's slide will be waiting for you.
Wonderful. Sounds good.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to it. I just want to, be sensitive to everyone's time. It's always good to stretch. So I will begin in about 5 minutes. So local time here for me, about 2:07 or about 12:07 on Greenwich Mean Time. So looking forward to speaking to you, and we'll be on soon.
Thank you very much,
just
David.
to add, sorry, David, just to add that instead of starting with that, why don't you add 3 minutes more? Then you start right on the 10 minutes.
Okay, perfect.
Instead of 5 minutes. Yeah.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, just tell me when to begin, and I'll be at the ready.
Okay, then. 10 minutes.
Wonderful.
Time. Yep. So David, you should just start preparing in the next 1 minute. We should be on. Thank you very much. So while we're on that, I will encourage Fadi and Gerard to please check the private chat and then see if there are some questions you can respond to directly. Thank you.
Moses, why don't we go ahead with the next presentation from David and then, yeah.
Yeah, so we're ready, and ladies and gentlemen, David is back, and David Carlin is taking module 4, climate risk financial disclosures, guidance for African financial institutions. And so David has about 25 minutes to take us through this. So David, you have the floor.
All right, sounds great. So thanks so much for having me here. There's been a lot of really interesting sessions, and it looks like you have a terrific program over the next 2 days as well. So as I said, really thrilled to be here with a lot of climate change makers across the continent and institutions that are really doing good work, both in preparing their nations and regions to deal with the climate challenge, but also how to find opportunities in that challenge. And so what I'm going to talk about a bit more is climate risks in particular, focusing on sub-Saharan Africa. Of course, that's a big geography. There's a lot of diversity in challenges and risks, but hopefully by doing that, this can spur some of the thinking on maybe some of the risks that maybe we didn't necessarily think about as climate risk, climate linked, but indeed are. Then we'll talk a bit about how these are transmissible or connected to the financial sector itself. Essentially, why does this matter for us in a business sense? And then we'll talk about, based on that, how the TCFD was designed in order to address some of those concerns and considerations. And then finally give a bit of guidance around the latest developments that we're seeing from other regions, which in some cases can indicate good practice on the behalf of regions in Africa. With the introduction to climate risk itself, what I would say is important to note that very often we think of climate risk in far too limited a context. We often about all of human and natural systems that are impacted by elements of climate. And so it's not necessarily the case to say climate causes this issue, but rather for almost every major environmental or human challenge, climate adds additional difficulty and additional problem. Examples of this are, there are always hot regions of the world, but those regions will get hotter, and that's going to result in Hi, can everyone hear me? I'm hearing some background.
Yes, Mr. David, go ahead. I disabled the microphone of one participant. Thank you.
Okay, sure. Yeah, no, I just wanted to make sure I wasn't missing any questions or if anyone had trouble hearing me. But what I was saying is we've always had places that are hot, but with climate, it's not that those places will be less hot. Of course, they will be more hot. And so these are already hot places getting hotter, getting past the point where worker productivity is impacted, where human health is affected. Another case is there have always been areas that are drought prone and flood prone. Unfortunately, climate change is likely to increase the prevalence of droughts. And when rains do come, they're more likely to be severe and thus to increase runoff. So these are the examples when we think about this. We can also think about in terms of diseases. As warmer climate spread, what we can start to see is various diseases that may have been confined in certain areas can extend their range, whether that's potential for malaria to reach areas of the highlands, or whether it's other types of diseases that previously weren't able to thrive. So you have real health costs and productivity costs. You also, of course, have the potential damages and destructions to real assets. And so these are droughts, but also, again, storms. And so I think the right way to think of climate is, what is the universe of risks you're currently thinking about, and how will climate impact it, rather than trying to think of climate as a separate risk or a separate set of challenges. And when we think about climate and specifically the types of risks that exist, we really like to break those into two types, both physical and transition risks. Transition risks tend to be the types of risks that result from the change to a low carbon economy. So that shift will have impacts across the whole economy. So that will mean supply chains may be impacted, manufacturing processes, fueling processes will be affected, and those can be affected by policies. So we talk about policy risks, technology risks, so changes in the relative economic competitiveness of one energy form versus another, as well as market risks, changes in the willingness of institutions to make loans to certain activities, or consumer preferences to say, oh, we'd rather switch to consuming less meat, or oh, we'd rather switch to getting our power from renewable sources. So those are on the risks that are driven not by the physical environment change, but by instead the impacts on the economy from a transition to that lower or net zero world. On the physical side, these are the changes that occur due to a warming planet. Typically, we think of two of those: incremental risks, meaning risks that change the baseline. So is average precipitation going to rise or fall in a region? Is average temperature going to rise or fall? And then more acute or extreme events. And those are the single one-off events, a specific heat wave, a specific fire, a particular storm. And so both of those things function together. If you think a little bit about it as the incremental risks are changing the baseline, and the extreme events are extreme deviations from a mean, but that mean itself is changed and modified by that changing baseline. So if we think about those as the two types of risks, then what makes sense is to think about how we often understand the choices that are made between them, because as you might have supposed, the more action we take to limit climate change, the more the world will have to transition. The less action we take to limit climate change, the less transition is necessary, but the more damages come from the physical impacts. And so very often when we at UNEP-FI think about transition risks, we tend to think in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions. How quickly do those emissions need to fall? And so when we think about how tough a transition is or how severe a transition is, the key thing we look for in a scenario is how quickly the emissions need to fall and when do they reach zero. So what is that net zero point, if there is one in the scenario? You can see the yellow, black, and gray lines don't reach net zero, whereas the other ones do. And so you can see it's more of a transition challenge to make that change than it is to make a slower change. On the other side, the mirror image of that is the faster we make those changes, the lower the final temperature is likely to be, as we will stop increasing the amounts of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And so when we look at a scenario for physical risk, if we want to understand how severe that scenario is, typically we're interested in looking at how quickly the temperature rises. And so on the transition side, it's emissions themselves. On the physical side, it's temperature that gives us a clue into how severe a scenario may be. And so moving from there into explaining a couple of the challenges that are faced by the region, we can talk both about the physical and transition challenges with the idea of explaining why this matters and why this is important to regional institutions. When it comes to water stress, this is one of the areas of the world where there are significant portions, especially near the deserts or on the outlying regions of the deserts, so the Sahel most notably, where there is significant risk of potential changes in rainfall patterns, meaning greater potential for drought, greater potential for challenges in harvests. And what we can see is that as temperatures warm, what the indicator on the top right is showing is as temperatures get warmer, the impacts on GDP, while they're different depending on which region of Africa you're considering, while they're different, there's markedly increasing impacts depending on the higher temperatures you get to. And so the important thing to really note here is that without water, you have issues not only with productivity and food production, but also with all of the other economic activities that demand that water. Water also has been correlated with increases in conflict. And so we see this as a emergent risk and one that certain areas, as you can see, may be particularly likely to be exposed to. The western part of the continent in particular as one area that is likely to be experiencing significant challenges from this. Another problem is heat. And for equatorial regions, this is the fact that as temperatures rise, either more energy is required to put in cooling, whether that's in the form of fans or in the form of air conditioning, but those things require energy. Of course, that energy creates a feedback loop of putting greater demand on the grid. And in countries all around the world, many of the cases of blackouts or cases of disruption in power supply have come during hot summer days, have come during heat waves. Make living spaces habitable. This also is a particular danger for workers who make their livelihood outside, such as farmers, as well as related industries, because as these temperatures rise over time, it's highly likely that there are areas that will become, on many days over the summer and into other months of the year, dangerously hot, and that will have, of course, healthcare costs. It will also have decreases in productivity as temperatures spike well over 40 C. And that also has negative knock-on effects on crop productivity. It has negative effects on biodiversity, recognizing that for many of the species, whether they're agricultural species or native species, the hotter temperatures will make that a particularly harder environment to thrive in. Now to talk a little bit on the transition side, and then I'm going to just pause for some quick questions before we get into the financial linkages. But I think one of the big points to note on the transition side is Sub-Saharan Africa is resource rich, and that's in a lot of ways a really good thing. The challenge is that many of those resources will need to be deployed toward supporting renewables, will need to be deployed toward new technologies. And the big challenge there is how can that be done in a way that is environmentally sustainable and economically sustainable for the people in these countries. So as spikes in demand for things such as lithium, for other battery elements become more pronounced, how do big countries like the Democratic Republic of the Congo, how do big countries effectively address these challenges? And also in countries where there is significant oil, such as Nigeria, how do they deal with the drawdown in this 20th century source of government revenue and think about diversification. So depending on which country we're talking about, we can see either very high proportions of hydrocarbon revenues, which is a potential transition risk, or potential high demand for new technologies, things like nickel, cobalt, and others, where there's a high potential for growth, but also that growth needs to be carefully considered along the lines of proper treatment of the environment, as well as sustainable development. Finally, the last point to say is that as this transition goes on, when government revenue streams are affected, this provides a challenge to those governments in order to provide their people with basic needs. And we've seen this in some cases in the Middle East, where when there are persistently low oil prices, that there need to be cuts to benefits provided by those governments to their populations. In many cases, there are political instabilities that are just below the surface that can be solved or can be at least kept at bay by the government provisions. When a resource is either not sellable on the world market or is running low, or when there are supply chains that are disrupted for critical goods like food and water, that's where instabilities can boil to the surface. And so when you have areas where institutions are already challenged, these transitions, whether they're from the transition to the low carbon economy or disruptions from physical risks, can pose real threats, not only to economic life in a country, but also to the overall stability of it. So let me stop there just to say, this is by no means a comprehensive view of climate risks across the continent, but it is, I hope, a view that shows just how some of these factors of development, of human health, of economics are linked and connected into climate, really trying to get you to think more expansively. And in the next two sections, we'll just spend about 5 or 10 minutes total talking about the connection to financial institutions. But let me stop there, and I'm interested to hear if there are any questions. Otherwise, we'll move on to the next couple sections.
Okay. I think we should, if you have any question, please, you are free to either send it via the chat, or you can raise up your hands, and we'll take it quickly before we move on. We just have less than 8 minutes for this session to be through.
Okay, so in that case, why don't we go on to the next items, and then we can cover those questions later or offline. So as I've laid out a number of potential physical and transition risks, I think it's important to note that those risks are ones that are not just risks to the real economy, but risks from a financial sector perspective, because they affect either potential asset values for investors or potential repayments for lenders. And so this is the idea that damages to physical assets or damages to supply chains can hurt revenues. It can also hurt abilities to repay. Changes in overall markets can have impacts on the future viability of a business or the size of that market overall. This page from the IMF does a good job of capturing some of those effects, thinking about both physical and transition risks being ones that can disrupt business, that can damage assets, that can change the value of assets, and that can increase commodity prices, whether those are energy prices or input prices, such as we were talking about commodities for renewables. Those can have impacts on overall asset values, individual wealth in the sense of retail products, as well as potential risks to corporate profits. Finally, those impacts, though, have the potential to create market risks through the revision of value, credit losses through potential non-repayment, as well as operational risks, both reputational risks from funding businesses and activities that are seen as damaging to the environment, as well as potential litigation risks. This is another example from the Bank of England going through that same point, looking at those three main risk pillars, credit, market, and operational risk, and explaining how they can be connected to the physical and transition risks that exist. You can see physical risks having impacts on mortgages. You could see them also causing repricing in debts. On the transition side, you can see the reputational risks I talked about, as well as potential disruptions in technology or changes in policy that make certain activities less economical. Ultimately, the TCFD has recognized this, and so the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures was created to take the climate risks that have been identified in the financial sector and bring questions about them into financial decision-making. This was really the lack of information and knowledge that was necessary to address. And so the TCFD Secretariat, what they looked to do was effectively address this through better reporting and better information. And so the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, the TCFD, was created by the Financial Stability Board in order to help stakeholders, regulators, investors, internal management, and others understand what the particular risks are and how companies are dealing with them. And so that means looking at these four main pillars: governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. Within each of those four pillars are sub-disclosures, so 11 recommended disclosures that specifically ask for more detail on the risks and opportunities that are identified by the firm, as well as the action plans that firm has for dealing with them. And so by providing this framework, the goal is to help both standardize and more easily compare what steps institutions are taking on climate and what actions they are able to pursue. So just to now conclude with a few brief notes about that TCFD framework, I would say that in the work that has been done to date by the TCFD Secretariat, that Financial Stability Board group, as I mentioned, there's a high degree of institutional interest in improving disclosures. And already we're seeing nearly 2,000 institutions sign on to make TCFD disclosures, but we're still seeing challenges with addressing data. We're still seeing challenges with making these comparable or potentially fully usable. But ultimately, we are seeing continued improvement in those disclosures. And through the work that we have done at UNEP-FI, we've aimed to provide guidance on where some of those risks exist, what the implications are for risk management and climate scenario analyses, as well as what tool providers are out there that can be effectively leveraged to help you make those assessments. Globally, I think we're seeing increasing regulatory interest and focus on these topics. Some of the questions and topics that have become particularly relevant are around climate disclosures themselves. So many of these regulators have taken the point of saying that the TCFD is a framework that they want to use in making disclosures and a framework that they want to use to mandate disclosures from their supervised institutions. Similarly, we're also seeing a lot of energy around stress testing. A number of institutions in Europe and Asia are increasingly either running stress testing pilots or have come out with explicit climate stress testing guidance, and we expect others around the world to follow suit. You can see global developments continuing as well in the US, in parts of Asia, and on that prior page, some information about what's going on in Africa and Europe. And finally, just to conclude, I've put together a few pages on those four pillars: governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets around good practice and what does it mean to make a good disclosure. So ultimately, I think here is a good place to conclude. If you have questions about anything that I've shared today or you'd like to know more, really glad to speak with you further offline. But in order to hand back to the session organizers, I will give them the microphone back. So thank you again for having me, and very excited to continue these important conversations.
Yeah, thank you very much, David. That was great and kept to time. So in order not to waste our time, we're moving to module 5. And that should be the last presentation for today. And then after that, we will have the question and answer session, the Q&A session. And that session, every presenter so far from module 1 to module 5, please, you should stand by to be able to respond to questions that have been asked. More questions are also likely to come. And that session, I'm going to coordinate it. So I'm calling on Mark Dabrel. Mark is talking about understanding of the climate finance, understanding of the climate finance landscape in Africa, and the paths to assessing climate finance for green investments. I take that again, quite interesting. Understanding of the climate finance landscape in Africa and the paths to assessing climate finance for green investment. So Mark, you're on call now. You have about 20, 25 minutes to do this. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you again. I'm glad that most of the speakers before me already outlined the main issues around climate finance. So I may be going quickly through some of the slides. And the thing is that is it possible to share the slide?
Yes, sir. You can share your desktop. Thank you.
Do you have the presentation? Could you share it, please? This is for the organizer. Could you please share the presentation?
Okay, we've heard.
Okay, sir.
They are going to share it.
Okay, all right. So the idea is to say that understanding the climate finance landscape in Africa and the pathway to accessing climate finance for green investment maybe at the same time theoretical because it's based on principle, on guidelines, but it's also very concrete because at the end of the day, it is the best way, the most efficient way to access climate finance and accelerate and catalyze the path toward implementing the NDCs. Most of our countries are in the revising period, and I think that it's a momentum so that accessing climate finance could be something very key, the backbone of all the revising process, most of all for African countries and also in West Africa. Next, please. So I would like to go through this presentation with four different parts. First of all, presenting the climate finance landscape globally in Africa. After that, having maybe a focus on the specific mapping of climate finance vehicles and instruments. And third, addressing the main eligibility criteria for the windows for the climate finance windows. And fourth, process of of the granting of funding by the climate windows. Next, please. Next, please. For the first part, the idea maybe is to focus on three main ideas. The first one, it was outlined before, is everything related to the needs and expectation for Africa, more specifically. We know that over than $3 trillion is required for Africa to meet the NDC's targets. And this is huge, but this is a challenge. These are the needs, and these are the expectations. But above that, the idea is to say, and the second idea is to say, how could we organize, how could we engage to mobilize all these huge amounts? So this second idea is to outline on leveraging both the public and the private sector. We know that strategically and more, leveraging public funds should be also to mobilize the private sector funding, because at the end of the day, the main difference is gathering all these funds together that could be a success. And the third idea is to have maybe to face this huge investment, the large scale-up investment and the small ones. We need for Africa more specifically to focus on adaptation, not only mitigation, because most African countries have outlined this since the Paris Agreement in 2015, and it's still a reality for Africa. It's still the part of the need, the urgent need. It's still part of the urgent expectation. So these three main ideas will be the background to understand or contribute to understanding climate finance landscape and give the pathway to access climate finance for green investments. Next, please. And I would like to start with some definition. And as I was mentioning, the speakers before me brilliantly outlined some of these definition. But we wanted just to go through the definition of the UNFCCC Secretariat, which is defining climate finance as a local, national, or transnational financing, which can come from public, private, or alternative source of financing. The ODI is also suggesting that climate finance should be public and private financial resources to help developing countries mitigate and adapt to the impact of climate change. So in both cases, the idea is to have this kind of triptych, the climate mitigation, the climate adaptation, and the dual benefits. And to summarize, climate finance should be considered as any local, national, or transnational funding from public, private, or alternative sources for activities that reduce greenhouse gas emission or help society adapt to climate change. Beyond this definition, next please, the idea is that we can figure out that one of the main trend, one of the main references to have an idea of the major trend on the landscape of climate finance is to refer to the MDBs. And as you can see in this slide, two main ideas could be, we could focus on these two main ideas. The first one is the mitigation resources mobilized versus adaptation. So from within a total of $61 billion, you see that mitigation is taking around 46 billion, and adaptation only 14. So you see that there is a gap, a big difference. And while Africa is expecting and asking for financing adaptation because of urgent needs, we have this gap, and definitely it has to be addressed properly. But you also have another trend. The other trend is related to public sector and not versus and private sector. When you look at the table on the right side, you see that the public recipients of the borrower, they receive much more than the private sector. For the MDBs, we can have we outline 41 billion received from the public sector, while for the private sector we also mention 17 billion. So this also has to be addressed properly, as we know that we can definitely have success in implementing the NDC if we have the public sector resources being leveraged to mobilize the private sector. It's still a challenge, and this challenge has to be addressed. On that note, I wanted also to maybe next please. I wanted also to mention that when talking about the large amount, the amount mobilized by the MDBs, the 61 billion, you can see that from these 3 trillion needed, expected for Africa, the gap is huge. The need is very crucial, and this has to be taken also into consideration. Then the mapping has also to look at the financial instrument for climate action. We can have grants. It was mentioned already. This is the basic. We can have the project level debt. We can have also equity. Maybe we should have a look, better look at this, because we are supporting here in West Africa the SMEs, and we realize that this instrument, in terms of project level equity, in terms of equity, was not enough used, and this is something to address properly. The balance sheet financing is also another financial instrument. The line of credit also, but the policy-based financing also, which is also key. The result-based financing, which is could be related to adaptation also, and with the incentive mechanism. We have the bonds, the green bonds, and finally, all the de-risking tools and mechanisms, such as the guarantees and the credit enhancement. So this is for the financial instrument for climate action. But we consider that we could have 2 main types of climate finance, in terms of if we want to put them in 2 different categories. So this instrument could be arranged and implemented through two different types of climate financing. The first one, next please, is what we could have as a specific climate financing, focusing primarily with the primary objective, primary outcome and objective on mitigation, greenhouse gas mitigation and climate change adaptation. So this would be the specific climate financing or maybe direct one, because on the other end, we can have and mention the indirect climate financing that encompass a much broader set of capital flow that will influence directly or indirectly emission and or vulnerability to climate change without this being the primary purpose. These include flows to support development and economic growth in emission causing or climate change vulnerable sector, such as water, health, energy, forestry, or agriculture. Next, please. Once we have categorized this climate finance, we can also mention, next please, the sources of intermediaries, sources and intermediaries, because you can have a private climate finance flow, but you can have also sources coming from the public sector. Within the range of the private climate flows, finance flows, we could mention the corporate financing, but the household also, the commercial financial institution, the institutional investors, and the structured private equity, venture capital, and infrastructure debt funds. And within the range of the public climate finance flow, we can mention some of them, like the DFIs one, with the multilateral and regional, the bilateral and the national ones financing, the government and the agency, and the climate fund. This is for the, but both coming from the private sources and from the climate sources has to be taken into consideration, maybe to be one of the perspective and the solution as the blending finance, because we know that these climate finance issues are sometimes complex, and we need to address it on a case-to-case basis. We need to contextualize them, and most of the time, this blending finance will be relevant and appropriate. From these sources and intermediaries, the idea is maybe after this mapping is to go through the challenges of climate finance in Africa. Next, please. So for the challenges of climate finance in Africa, we know most of them, but we could mention some of them. First of all, we can mention the concept of sustainable development and its operationalization. It's not always well known. It's not always well understood. So much needs to be done in terms of awareness, information, sensitization. We could also mention the systemic issue, climate change as a systemic issue for the financial sector. And there again, we have the mobilization and awareness challenges, more specifically with the Article 2 of the Paris Agreement. And the idea is that the idea is to redirect investment in line with low carbon development. On this stream of the financial sector, controlling the risk linked to climate change is also key. And the speaker before me with the TCFD also mentioned all all these ideas, and also transition to a new business model. We are shifting, as you know, within this transition. In most of our businesses day to day, what is done now will not be anymore done the same way in a few years. And then some other challenges are access to climate finance. We know that the needs are huge, but the resources may be around, but access to this climate finance for Africa still remain a huge challenges. The level of knowledge and technical skills is also part of it, because once you don't have the technical skills, it will be difficult to have the right, the most relevant and the most efficient approach. The regulatory environment is also one of the challenges to be mentioned, because we could consider that the public sector definitely could be part of the solution and be able to put in place the enabling environment to accelerate and catalyze this transition. Next.
Please, I think you should round up now. Time is fast spent. I mean, you should round up. You should round up. You should round up your presentation, please.
Okay. All right. Okay. Next, please. Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes, we do. Thank you.
All right. So next slide, please. I didn't hear you well.
I was saying that you should try to round up. Your time is spent already. All right.
Okay. All right. But okay. So basically, we have a huge challenge to mobilize the resources and to access climate finance. We need it. We expect it in Africa, but definitely we need to put in place all the schemes and all the enabling environment in order for community, the country, private sector to get access to this climate finance. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mark. You know, we are pressed for time, and so we need to move on quickly. Now we are going to the Q&A session. At present, we have about 7 questions which has been sent earlier. 3 of those questions are for the bank to answer. So I hope that anyone from the bank, once I raise those questions, whoever wish to respond can do that. Then we have about 3 other questions for Professor Chukwumerije Okereke. So I hope you are still on the call, Professor Chukwumerije Okereke, and 1 question for Louis Perrault. So I go with the bank question. The first question for the bank is from Temilola Visa Mabogunje. She says, this is for the bank. Please, are participants going to be given some of the workshop materials? Are participants going to be given some of the workshop materials? That's the first question for the bank. There's a second question for the bank. How does climate change affect AfDB's energy policy? How does climate change affect AfDB energy policy? Why is the policy review not yet effective to integrate the climate change agenda? Also, what is the volume of the bank's commitments to climate change, and how does This is quite long one. How does climate change play in the bank's operation? I think we should take those two first questions, then I can ask the third one. Someone from the bank, please.
Okay, I think this is Gerard. I think I'll answer, and then I think if my other colleagues on the call can also supplement what I'll answer. I think the first question about the material, yes, I want to provide the material to all registered participants so they can have a quick review after the session. So materials will be made available. So the second question about the climate and energy, I think at first the bank, there was a confusion, a mix up between the climate policy and the energy policy. But now I think we're drawing a line between the energy policy and the climate policy of the bank. Yeah, the bank is not drafting two different policies, one for energy and the policy on climate change. So that confusion will no longer occur again as time goes on. So I think the policies are under review. Once they are approved by the bank, I think the bank will start implementation of both the energy policy and the climate policy. So I know the energy policy has an implication on the climate policy, and the climate policy will have an implication on the climate on the energy policy. They are all like affecting each other. So, but that discussion is ongoing. I think what's important about the energy policy is that the issue about emissions and coal are being handled under the energy policy, and the bank is not financing any coal projects again. So there are other issues that the bank also taking into consideration that are under the energy policy. So that going forward, there will be a separate policy on climate and another policy on energy. So the bank is working on that.
Okay, there's two other parts of that question, which says, what is the volume of the bank's commitment to climate change? And how does climate change play in the bank's operation?
Yeah, I think the volume, I think the bank is, for the past 5 years, the bank has been consistently reporting climate finance. I think the figure has increased significantly. I think anyone want to know what the bank volume about or performance on climate finance, look at the joint NDB climate finance tracking report, which is available online. You can Google it. You'll see from 2011, 2012, right up to 2019. I think for 2020, the report is still under review. So just Google the joint MDB climate finance report. You'll see what the bank is contributing for that. And then the last part of the question is about. And then we also do mainstreaming. We mainstream all our policy, all our project and policy with climate action. So we take that into consideration. And the bank is also part of the MDB that we're working on the other MDB developing what we call the building blocks for climate change, how to align MDB operation with Paris alignment. So the bank is doing a lot of work on that aspect as well. So we have joint session with other MDBs, and also we're supporting our regional member countries to promote enabling environment for climate action in respective other member countries.
Okay, thank you very much, Gerard. But there's a third question for the bank. This is coming from Shingetai Shikara. The second question was asked by Babaka Diop. Why this current question is being asked by Shingetai Shikara? It says, coal is considered one of the main polluters, and financials now hesitate financing fossil energy projects. I take that again. Coal is considered one of the main polluters, and financiers now hesitate financing fossil energy projects. Now the question is, what is AfDB's stance? Is that stance cognizant of recent environmentally friendly technologies, which is less than 5% emissions emitted in Europe? So anybody from the bank who wants to respond to that?
Yeah, I will still respond to that. I think the bank has not financed any coal project for almost 10 years now. So, and like I said, even when the climate policy was not there, even the energy policy, the coal is not financing for a long period of time. So the bank is not financing any coal projects. So yeah, it has not done that. So we know coal emits a lot of CO2 emission, but I think the bank is not financing any coal project as of now. We're more focused on renewable energy and energy efficiency, and also power lines to promote energy assets, and not financing of coal.
Okay, thank you very much, Gerard. So our next question, before I go to Professor Shukwu Merije, please, I hope you're on the call. I would like to send this particular question to Louis. Louis, I hope you are still on the call. This is from Olutobi Osanaye. Olutobi Osanaye. And the question is, every time there is a natural disaster as a result of climate change, we acquire debt. This has brought on a vicious circle where we get in debt. We reconstruct, it gets destroyed. We get into debt, we rebuild, and it gets destroyed again. Now the question is, do we have any insurance plan for that at all? Do we have any insurance plan for that at all? So Louis.
It's difficult. Obviously, normal case, if you have a house and it gets destroyed, and then you apply for a new insurance. Every insurance plans are yearly renewable, right? So it's up to the insurance company to increase the premium or not. That's usually what's happening. In some cases, and I know the case of boats in marinas, boats for sailing boats, where the people don't insure their boats anymore because it's just too expensive. It's not worth it. They prefer to take the risk. So in some cases, people start taking the risk. I know in forestry as well. Forestry, some parts of Europe, the insurance is just too high now, so the people just prefer to take the risk. So to answer this question, it's really a case per case. However, there's one thing that the insurance companies are thinking more and more about, and it's not really in place yet. It's precautionary measures. That means that if you built your house thinking about this and that, which would make it less vulnerable to future whatever wind or whatever that is, then you pay less premium. You have an incentive to have precautionary measures. In which case your premium may go down. You rebuilt your house, but you rebuilt it in such a way that it's less vulnerable. The insurance knows about it. There's certain standards, and therefore, yeah, your premium actually goes down. I hope I answered the question.
Okay. Prof, are you around? Can you indicate if you're around before I take your questions? Professor Shukwu Merije, are you still around?
It's not.
Okay. If Prof is not around, then maybe one of our other presenters will go to handle that. But for now, I have two questions for Mark. Mark, I have two questions for you. I hope you are on this call. Now, your first question is this. Under financial instrument for climate actions, there was mention of policy-based financing and result-based financing. What are those? Please explain more. I take it that again, Mark.
Yes.
Under financial instruments for climate actions, there was mention of policy-based financing and results-based financing. What are those? Kindly explain before we take the last question. And that question is from Edwin Maniani. Edwin Maniani. So, Mark.
Okay. Thank you, Edwin. Maybe I will share two examples.
Can you switch off your? Can you switch off your video? I think it's affecting the audio.
All right. Okay. Yeah. Maybe better now.
Yeah.
Okay. So the related to the result-based financing, I would mention the payment for environmental services, which is an incentive mechanism related to forestry and agriculture, and which is aiming at incentivizing the communities and the farmers to have better practice and to plant trees within their compounds. But the idea is to have both adaptation action and mitigation And this result-based financing is a payment. This incentive is a payment. This is all the schemes put in place by a few countries now in West Africa related to forestry and agriculture. Related to the policy-based financing, I would mention the energy sector. And the idea is that in some of the countries, for example, in terms of audits for energy efficiency, the regulation put in place is putting a cap so that most of the companies have to be engaged into energy efficiency and using alternative energy and technology, renewable technology tools. And once you have done that, from this policy-based, from this regulation-based, you pave the way to enhance and to catalyze the energy sectors in some of the countries. These are the examples, but I could add more on that. But this is just the idea to say that policymakers have to be part and get engaged and they have the solution for financing and also the result-based also payment will be part of the financing from the public and the private sector.
Thank you very much, Mark. Now, the second question for you is from Charles Omari. And the question is, should a financial institution finance a climate adaptation project, even if it's not very profitable? Mark. Mark, are you still on the call?
Sorry, my connection is not good. Could you repeat, please?
Okay, I'll do that again. He said, should a financial institution finance a climate adaptation project, even if it's not very profitable? Question is from Charles Omari.
Okay. I think that one of the challenges is to invest into adaptation, to finance adaptation, but also to see that in two different ways. The first way, as you know, is the grant approach, is to finance the communities, for example, to finance all the farmers, but on the grant approach. But you also have the approach for adaptation that can have a kind of blend private and public that could also aim at having profitability. We could consider that if we want to mainstream adaptation financing, we need to put it in a way that it can start with a grant, it can start with and then come to blended finance. But at the end of the day, if you want the community to sustain this investment, if you want the farmer or the farmer organization to sustain this investment, though it is within the adaptation scope, you have to look at the means and tools to have a window of profitability. You can have both, financing just adaptation without profitability, or doing it on a profitability purpose.
Thank you very much, Mark. We still have a set of questions here. I would like to put Dr. Eugene Itua on this call. Either himself or anyone from the bank can answer. We have 3 sets of questions here. So Dr. Eugene, I hope you are still on this call. Dr. Eugene, are you on this call? Okay, great. The first question is from Khalid Omar. Khalid Omar Badia. It says, in the GEG, that's greenhouse gas emission by sector, there was a category of other energy. Please elaborate on that and what it entails, since there is another category of electricity and heat. I take that again. In the greenhouse gas emission by sector, there was a category of other energy. Please elaborate on that and what it entails, since there is another category of electricity and heat. Thank you.
Well, I'm not too sure where that, when that was said or was presented. So I will say I'm not in position to respond to that. But just to let us know that there are, when it comes to emissions issue, you have scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 in that manner. And so you can find out more details about this because it will create more opportunity for you to with regard to that. But just to say that I really do not know which slides presented that.
I think that slide is from a prof slide. It's from prof slide. This set of questions are from prof slide.
Don't worry, the set of questions for prof, what I'll just simply say is that keep them for him. He's going to respond to them. Even if not today, he will respond to them and then we share.
Okay, great.
Let the experts that presented their team respond to their questions. Others should not respond to it, except they just want to enrich what has been presented or what the expert has said. And that is why we have it allocated to each expert to respond adequately.
Okay, thank you very much. But just to allow Abdul Aziz, they'll also know that we have a question, which was how to truly engage states in implementing their CDN and financing the less polluting climate transition. That also is for Professor Chukwu Merige, and there's a third one from Kumbi Adeshokon. Kumbi Adeshokon said there is a need to begin to advocate for more mandatory sustainability reporting from African governments, so organizations are focused to go on this route. Right now, because it is not mandatory, most companies do not see the need to comply. So these will be responded to. We can guarantee you that between tomorrow and next tomorrow, you will get those responses, most likely on the chat, and you will also be informed too. Now, before I take the closing remarks, I would like to call on anyone from the bank if there's anything you want to say before we take the closing remark. Gerard, Fade, any comments before we take the closing? Since there is no comment coming from them, I would like to say that we thank everyone for being part of this. At last count, we still have about 145 people on this call, which is quite great, considering the fact that at peak period, we were looking at about 193, 194 participants, which is far beyond the expectation that we had, which is quite great. Now, for tomorrow, which is day 2, the workshop starts at the same time, and we will be having a lot of, I think about 1 or 2 breakout sessions tomorrow. And that way we'll be looking at hands-on on some tools, some screening tools, climate risk and opportunity screening tools, and the business carbon footprint tool for testing. So all this will be handled tomorrow. There'll be breakout session. Those breakout sessions will have the English and the French speaking participants in different rooms at some point. Then we'll come back again and also have a general discussion before we close. And those will be taken by Belinda, Petri, and Sarah Wiwinje. So please, tomorrow we look forward to meeting you at the same time. And thank you for being part of this. Just before we go, I would like everyone to put on their camera so that we can take a group photograph. Please put on your camera if you are still on this call. We want to see your faces. We want to see your faces. We want to see your faces. James, where are you? Fade, everyone, Gerard, Lois, put on your faces. Abdullahi Nado, put on your faces so that IT coordinators can snap from their end and say hi. Hi. That's been great. Oh, thank you very much. Let's have, okay, great. So thank you for being part of this. We look forward to your participation tomorrow, active participation tomorrow. And then please keep bringing the questions, send them ahead, either through the emails I was shared with you after your registration or through the chat when we start tomorrow. God bless you. See you, bye.
Bye, thank you.
Yeah, bye.
Thank you, Moses.
Yeah, bye. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
Everyone.
Bye.
Thank you very much, Prof. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
I will probably never really know